You are here meeting every need.
Yes.
I worship you.
Yes.
I worship you. It's amazing how someone can speak. Someone can give a sermon. And different people get different things from that sermon. If you're thinking and you apply it to yourself, you can see maybe where the sermon really applies to you, but others saw it in a different light. I remember some pastor saying, or some member saying to a pastor, I really appreciate that sermon you gave. You said thus and such and thus and such. And he said, I didn't say that. Yes, you did. That's what they got from it. God was working with them and addressing the need that they had. Our text for the day is found in the New Testament in the book of Corinthians. Seems like we've been led to the writings of Paul more and more. But 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verses 1 through 13. And I got to adjust myself again to this spotlight here, because when it comes down, it blocks my notes. So if I look a little cockeyed, you know why. 1 Corinthians 10, verses 1 through 13. Is that light bothering someone else?
It bothers me.
Herb, you're the facilities man. Can you take care of that?
It'd be really, really dark in here.
That's all right. We'll just have to do with it.
It'd
Deal
be
with
really
it.
dark in here.
Okay, it'd be real dark without that light. All right, starting in verse 1 of 1 Corinthians 10. For I do not want you to be ignorant of the fact, brothers and sisters, that our ancestors were all under the cloud, and that they all passed through the sea. They were all baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. They all ate the same spiritual food and drank the same spiritual rock, for they drank from the spiritual rock that accompanied them, and that rock was Christ. Nevertheless, God was not pleased with most of them. Their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. Verse 6. Now, these things occurred as examples to keep us from setting our hearts on evil things as they did. Do not be idolaters, as some of them were. As it is written, for they sat down to eat and drink and got up to indulge in revelry. We should not commit sexual immorality, as some of them did, and in one day 23,000 of them died. We should not test God, as some of them did, and were killed by snakes. And do not grumble, as some of them did, and were killed by the destroying angel. These things happened to them as an example and are written down as warnings for us, on whom the culmination of ages have come. So, if you think you are standing firm, be careful that you don't fall. No temptation has overtaken you except what is common to mankind, and God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. But when you are tempted, He will also provide a way out so you can endure it. Father in heaven, we come as we are in your presence, Father. We are worshiping you. We thank you that you are the way maker. We pray, Father, that you would be with our congregation as this sermon is presented, Father, that those will get out of it, Father, what they need to. It's your word. It's Paul teaching to the Corinthians, Father, and something that we need to know, because he said it was examples for us to learn in this end time. Thank you. We ask your blessings and your inspiration in Jesus' name. Amen. Now, this first part of chapter 10 is labeled Warnings from Israel's History. They were lessons that Paul wanted the Corinthians to remember and learn from what the Israelites experienced. So he kind of reminds them, that is the Corinthians, of the history of the children of Israel. It's talking about God's relationship with his people. Paul is taking them way back to the time when God first started dealing with his people as a nation. That's what Paul is doing. He's taking them way back. He said, I want you to understand this. Of course, God had a relationship with Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. He had a relationship with Cain and Abel. One accepted, one rejected. He had a relationship with Noah, and he had a relationship with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But God had a special relationship with Abraham. God communicated with Abraham, and Abraham obeyed God. Remember the time when God tested Abraham to see if he would be obedient to God. Abraham knew that God was the heavenly Father of all. But God wanted to see just how much Abraham trusted and would obey him. So God requested that Abraham sacrifice his son, his only son, the long-awaited son, would sacrifice him on an altar to see if Abraham would obey him. Well, you might say, that was awfully cruel of God to ask this man to sacrifice on the altar his only son, his long-awaited son. When Abraham was about 100, when Isaac was born, and Sarah was 90. So there's still hope for all of you guys out there. You know the story. Abraham did obey God. And for Abraham's trust and obedience to his heavenly Father, this was God's promise to Abraham. Genesis 22, verses 15 through 18. The angel of the Lord called to Abraham from heaven a second time and said, I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring, all nations on earth will be blessed because you have obeyed me. God made a nation of Abraham's descendants. It was known as the Abrahamic covenant. Although Abraham was a faithful servant of God, his descendants were not. But God still loved them and had compassion on them. Yet Israel rebelled against God again and again. And they would be punished for what they would, and that they would go into captivity. I want to rehearse that. Genesis 15. Genesis 15, verses 12 and 13. As the sun was setting, Abram fell into a deep sleep, and a thick and dreadful cloud came over him. Then the Lord said to him, know for certain that for 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and they will be enslaved and mistreated there. Why? Because of their disobedience. Exodus chapter 1, verse 6. Now Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation died, but Israel the Israelites were exceedingly fruitful. They multiplied greatly, increased in numbers, and became so numerous that the land was filled with them. Part of the promise. They will be like the stars in heaven and like the sand on the beach, on the seashore. Then a new king, verse 8 of Exodus 1, then a new king to whom Joseph meant nothing came to power in Egypt. Look, he said to his people, the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous, and if war breaks out, will join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country. So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor, and they built Python and Ramses as store cities for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter with harsh labor in bricks and mortars and with all kinds of work in the fields. In all their harsh labor, the Egyptians worked them ruthlessly. Wow. You don't learn, so you suffer the consequences. Then chapter 2 of Exodus, verses 1 through 4. Now a man of the tribe of Levi married a Levite woman, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. When she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. And we knew you were talking about Moses. But when she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and coated it with tar and pitch. Then she placed the child in it and put it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. Verse 11. One day after Moses had grown up, he went out to where his own people were and watched them at their hard labor. So he watched the Israelites work hard. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. Looking this way and that and seeing no one, Moses killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. The next day, he went out and saw 2 Hebrews fighting. Now, he saw 2 people of his own nation fighting. He asked the one in the wrong, "Why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew?" The man said, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and thought, what I did must have become known. Verse 23 of chapter 2. During that long period, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out, and their cry for help because of their slavery went up to God. God heard their groanings, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. Now, what was that covenant that God made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? We see that in chapter 33. Now, I'm giving you just a little history of the Israelites, because this is probably what Paul did when he covered it with the Corinthians. Exodus 33, verses 1 through 3. Then the Lord, and this is the covenant, then the Lord said to Moses, "Leave this place, you and the people you brought up out of Egypt, and go up to the land I promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saying, I will give it to your descendants. I will send an angel before you and drive out the Canaanites, Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. Go up to the land flowing with milk and honey. But I will not go with you because you are a stiff-necked people, and I might destroy you on the way. I'm going to bless you with the land of milk and honey, but you guys have teed me off so much. You are so stiff-necked. I'm not going to just go with you, but I'm going to allow you to go. So, did you notice? They still continue to rebel against God despite his compassion. They were right near the promised land. They were near the promised land. But yet they continued to be stiff-necked. Now, going ahead in Exodus to chapter 14, we know what happened there. That was the Exodus. God delivered the children of Israel through the Red Sea. Chapter 14 talks about the children of Israel being delivered out of Egypt and how they crossed the Red Sea on dry ground with high waves on either side of them. You ever see the Ten Commandments? That great movie? The walls of, it was hard to imagine it until I saw that. In fact, you saw the wall of water going up, you saw the fishes going through. But the Israelites went through on dry land.
Amen.
How many was it, Mr. Washington? Was it 1 million of them? I don't remember either, but it was a whole bunch of them that Moses led out. Jump to chapter 14, which really actually talks about the Exodus, but I want to go down to verse 26. Exodus 14, verse 26. Then the Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand over the sea so that the waters may flow back over the Egyptians and their chariots and horsemen. Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at daybreak, the sea went back to its place. The Egyptians were fleeing toward it, and the Lord swept them into the sea. The water flowed back and covered the chariots and horsemen. The entire army of Pharaoh that had followed the Egyptians into the sea, not one of them survived. And as I remember correctly, the children of Israel at night followed the pillar of fire, right, through the Red Sea.
Amen.
And it took them almost all night to get through. And Pharaoh and his chariots didn't have the pillar of light. And they were after them in the dark. And their wheels came off their chariots, right, Meryl? I think that's what the movie said. And they start bumping into one another. They were driving through the sea at night. And then the children of Israel cleared the sea the next day. And that's when Moses set up his hand. It says at daybreak, Moses stretched his hand and the water came back. But they were driving into one another. Can you imagine their horses stumbling over each other as they went through the sea? Because they couldn't see. Where are you at? And they're just driving their horses, their chariots. Chapter 15, verse 19. When Pharaoh's horses, chariots, and horsemen went into the sea, the Lord brought the waters of the sea back over them, but the Israelites walked through the sea on dry land. Verse 20. Then Miriam, the prophet, Aaron's sister, took a timbrel in her hand, and all the women followed her with timbrels and dancing. Miriam sang to them, sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted. Both horses and driver he has hurled into the sea. So they celebrated. They had high celebration because they were brought out of the land of Egypt. The Israelites were safe now out of Egyptian captivity. after 400 years of oppression, they were free. We're in chapter 15. Oh, well, let's see. We've covered that. But what happened after they shortly left Egypt? These people that God was leading. Well, that brings us to our text today. 1 Corinthians chapter 10. That brings us to our text today. Okay, verse 1 of our text, 1 Corinthians 10 says, "For I do not want you to be ignorant of the fact, brothers and sisters, that our ancestors were under the cloud, and they all passed through the sea." Now, did you notice he was talking to the Corinthians who were Gentiles, and he said our ancestors. Ancestors, well, I mean, those were the children of Israel. They were Jews. But now they're all one, Jews and Gentiles alike. He said, our ancestors were under the cloud, and they all passed through the sea. Paul is telling the Corinthians that I do not want you to be ignorant of this fact, that all of Israel left Egypt. Our ancestors were under the cloud and passed through the sea. So God gave them guidance via the cloud as they left Egypt and passed through the Red Sea, a way that was safe and secure. Verse 2, they were all baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. Simply means that they were initiated and inaugurated under God into union with God and with Moses as God's leader for them. They were baptized. Baptism has many meanings. It was a union. They were united in this move through the Red Sea. Verses 3 and 4. They all ate the same spiritual food and drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock that accompanied them. And that rock was Christ. They were accompanied on this journey by Christ. Why did Paul say Christ? The Messiah wasn't in the Old Covenant, Old Testament. It wasn't until the New Testament. But he was the God of the Old Testament, right? Paul is talking in present tense. Christ is resurrected. Paul knew that it was Christ back then who brought them through. Who was with them? The one who became Jesus Christ of the New Testament. Paul could say, that rock who was Christ, who was with them. Because in the New Testament, Jesus Christ had come to this earth. The spiritual food and drink that God gave them are the miraculous provision he gave them as they traveled through the desert. Food, water, meat. Miraculously, they were means of God's grace to them at that time. Do they look at it as God's grace to us? No. Yes, they were spiritual food and drink provided by Christ. Verse 5. Nevertheless, God was not pleased with most of them. Their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. But however, God was not pleased with most of them. After answering their cries and pleas for deliverance and help time and time again, Israel still disobeyed God. Instead of recognizing God's presence and blessings, Israel still murmured and disobeyed. God was displeased, and Israel was judged in the wilderness. The people of Israel had the covenant blessings and were miraculously delivered and sustained. Yet most of them died in the wilderness because of disobedience and disbelief. Most of them died, and their carcasses were scattered over the desert. Talk about what, maybe 1 million people that came out. Can you imagine in this journey through the wilderness to the promised land? Most of them died for sins and different things that we're going to come to. And their carcasses, their corpse were spread all over the wilderness simply because of disobedience. The only two people that went into the promised land were who? Caleb and Joshua. Wow. Verse 6. Now these things occurred as examples to keep us from setting our hearts on evil things as they did. These things are lessons I want you to learn, Paul says, from your ancestors, and not duplicate them. They did, they desired, and they lusted after evil things. Read verse 7. Do not be idolaters, as some of them were. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and got up to indulge in revelry. This took place when the Israelites made a golden calf and worshipped it in the desert. They had Aaron make this golden calf. Then they ate a sacrificial meal in dedication to the calf, just as the other pagans did. And then they got up to play. Now, when the Bible talks about play, it's usually talking about sexual activities. This is the Israelites. To dance in ceremonial worship to the calf. It says in revelry. That's what the word says. So, that was one thing that Paul was warning the people against, was idolatry. Verse 8. We should not, Paul is saying, commit sexual immorality as some of them did. And in one day, 23,000 of them died. Sexual immorality. Have you noticed this subject pops up more and more around Gentile converts? And it was part of the lifestyle of their ancestors, the children of Israel. And Paul is warning them against that. Numbers 25. Numbers 25, verses 1 through 3. Now Israel was staying in Shittim. The men began to, this is our Israelite brothers and sisters, okay? Then men began to indulge in sexual immorality with Moab women, who invited them to the sacrifices of their gods. The people ate the sacrificial meal and bowed down before these gods. So Israel yoked themselves to the Baal of Peor, and the Lord's anger burned against them. Verse 6. Then an Israelite man brought into the camp a Midianite woman right before the eyes of Moses and the whole assembly of Israel, while they were weeping at the entrance of the tent of meetings. Verse 7. When Phinehas, son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron, the priest, saw this, he left the assembly, took a spear in his hand, and followed the Israelite into the tent. He drove the spear into both of them, right through the Israelite man and into the woman's stomach. Then the plague against the Israelites was stopped, but those who died in the plague were 24,000. So, the Israelites sinned against other men's wives. They sinned with the pagans in the land that they had inherited. They literally worshiped Baal of Peor, a pagan god. And for this horrific sin, 23,000 of them died in one day. 23,000 of them died in one day. Was that serious? It's kind of a conflict. I think this says 24,000 right here. I think in 1 Corinthians it says 24,000, but that doesn't include the 23 plus the others that God had Moses to kill because of indiscretions that they had done. So there was about 24,000 people killed. Now, I have a question for you today. What is your small g God that you're worshiping? What is your idol? Excessive alcohol, lying, cheating, putting your thumb on the scale when it comes to associates or the IRS, porn, women watching, undressing them with your eyes, men watching, undressing them with your eyes. My wife told me something interesting. Years ago in Chicago, we were in church there. She said, yeah, them women be looking at men too. They be looking at men's rear ends. Women do that too? Oh yeah. Fine. Is that what you told me? Watching, undressing them with your eyes. Gossiping, big one. Gossip.
Amen.
Is that your God? I mean, everything you hear, you have to share it. Fellowship with others. Lust, two-facedness. You're one way at church and you're another way when you get around with friends. Meddling. Some people got to meddle. What is your God? What do you spend your time doing? Now, I know I'm preaching to the choir. You know what that means, I'm preaching to the choir. Choir members are always there. They are always regular. You can depend upon them. You can count on them, right?
Amen.
Choir members, they understand this stuff that I'm talking about. Choir members always wear their blue puffy robes with the gold trim, around the neck and on the sleeves. And their robes are always freshly pressed. That's a choir member for you. They sit where they're supposed to sit. They sing their parts. They stay on key. That's a choir member. They stay until the end of services, and you never see them sneaking out the back early. Choir members play by the rules. I know I'm preaching to the choir today. And that's the problem. Choir members know these things, but they sometimes become calloused. It's the old regular, I'm always here, I'm always there. So they're kind of glazed eyes, but they know what they're supposed to do. Sometimes it seems as if they are just going along for the ride. They become lethargic. And we have to shake them up out of the lethargy. And that's what Paul is doing with the Corinthians. You guys are good people, but you got to get on the ball. You have to stay on the ball.
Yes.
Let's get back to our text here, verse 9. These are some of the problems, again, that Paul is warning the Corinthians that you don't want to do. Verse 9, it says, we should not test Christ as some of them did,
Yes.
and were killed by snakes. The Israelites tested God. Numbers 21. Maybe a little long today, but hopefully you get what I'm saying, what I'm talking about.
Yes.
Numbers 21, verses 5 and 6. They tested God. They spoke against God and against Moses and said, why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? There is no bread, there is no water, and we detest this miserable food. This manna, we detest that. Chapter 11, verse 4. Verses 4 through 6. The rabble with them began to crave other food. And again, the Israelites started wailing and said, if only we had meat to eat.
Yes.
We remember the fish we ate in Egypt at no cost. Also the cucumbers, melons, leeks, onions, and garlic. But now we have lost our appetite. We never see anything but this manna. They're tempting and testing God. We don't like the way you are dealing with us. Now, this surely displays an attitude of stout-heartedness and arrogance. How much can we push and get away with? How much can we push God and get away with? This attitude reflects skepticism over whether or not God should discipline them for their sins. We can push, he might not discipline us. Now, what kind of Christian is going to see how much he can get away with?
Amen.
With God? I mean, just keep pushing the envelope. You don't do that. Anyone who doubts that God can and will exercise his option to punish sin should learn a lesson about these fiery serpents, mentioned in verse 9. These venomous snakes that literally appeared and bit the people, and they died. Isn't that what it says in verse 9?
Amen.
We should not test Christ as some of them did and were killed by snakes.
Yes.
Verse 10. and do not grumble, as some of them did, and were killed by the destroying angel. Paul warns the Corinthians not to grumble here. We start to grumble when our attention shifts from what we have to what we don't have, right? Then we start to grumble. The children of Israel didn't seem to remember what God was doing for them. He set them free. God made a nation of them. He provided their needs in the wilderness. He offered them the promised land. I got some scriptures here, but I'm going to kind of skip over those and not refer to them. They could think of nothing but the delicious Egyptian food they had left behind. They were stuck in the past and couldn't appreciate the future. To murmur, grumble, or complain shows a total rejection of divine leadership. Do you realize that? To murmur, grumble, or complain shows a total rejection of divine leadership in your life. Nothing provokes the anger of God more than to chafe under the yoke that we share with Christ. Let me repeat that. Nothing promotes the anger of God more than to chafe under the yoke that we share with Christ. We share in his suffering. And if we're going to squirm, if we're going to wiggle, and if we're going to try to get out of it, God is not happy with that.
Amen.
Don't grumble. The results of grumbling, they were killed by the angel of God by way of a plague that fell upon the people. Got scriptures for that. We're going to bring this to a close. Verse 11. These things happened to them as examples and were written down as warnings for us, to whom the culmination of the ages have come. So, what were the sins of the Israelites? They desired evil things. They worshiped idols. There was sexual immoralities. They tested God.
Yeah.
They grumbled. Verse 12. So, if you think you are standing firm, be careful that you don't fall. Remember the sermon that I gave last week? We are to stand firm in Christ. Stand firm in the Lord. Yes, that's true that we are to stand firm. But don't be overconfident. And don't be self-righteous. Keep alert lest you fall. Don't be caught up in self-sufficiency. Verse 13. No temptation has taken you except what is common to man. And God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you are able to bear. But when you are tempted, he will also provide a way out so that you can endure it.
Amen.
Now, trials and temptations are not in and of themselves sin. God allows them as a way of purifying us. James 1, 12 through 13. But Satan will use these trials and these temptations to entice us to do wrong. Remember, temptations can come to us as Christians. Temptations that come to us as Christians are common to all human beings. They are unavoidable. They help us to be purified.
Yes.
When Paul is saying here, what Paul is saying here is that in any trial or tribulation, God is right there with us to keep us from being overwhelmed by that trial or tribulation. So when we do face temptations, and we will, God promises to help us. He will provide a way out, not to avoid the temptation, but to meet it on successfully and to stand firm under it.
Amen.
In summary, don't desire evil things. Stay away from idolatry.
Yes.
Stay away from sexual immorality. Don't tempt God. Just do what you're told to do because He loves you.
Yes.
It's for our best interest.
Yes.
Don't grumble and face temptations, and you will face temptations, and you will face them. It's common to all mankind. Learn to lean on God. He will help you. He wants to help you. Now, is that a loving God who tells you, I don't want you to do this. I don't want you to do that. I don't want you to do that because that's not good for you.
Yes.
You see the results. It says when they committed sexual immorality, 23,000 of them fell in one day. When they tempted Christ, they were bitten by snakes. When they grumbled, one verse says 14,700 of them died by a plague. But if you're tempted, come to me. Like was said in the Speaking of Life, my arms are wide open. Come to me. I don't want you to do these things. I don't want you to do that. But if you are tempted, come to me. Now that's a loving God. He's doing everything that He can to help us to be successful. I'm going to end with a short YouTube video. It's a song that we all know. It's a song that we have all sang. I have Sush put that up. And then I'll come back up to close with prayer. Yield not to temptation. Yield not to temptation, for easy is sin. He strengthly will help you, some others to win. Fight manfully onward, dark passions subdue. Look ever to Jesus, He will carry you through. Ask the Savior to help. He wants to. He's there.
Yes.
Ask the Savior to help you. He's there for us.
Amen.
Father in heaven, thank you so very much. Paul gave us words as he was talking to the Corinthians, things that are examples that we should learn from and that we should follow, things that we should not do.
Yes.
Those are errors, those are sins, those brought death upon our ancestors. And yet, when we're faced with things that we don't know how to handle,
Yes.
you promise you will not give us anything that's more than we can handle,
Yes.
but that you are there. Just ask you, lean on you, trust in you. Thank you for such loving concern for us. Thank you for
Yes.
such open arms for us. We just ask, Father, that we will follow these instructions and that we will put you first and foremost in our lives and in all that we do. We will think about the love that you have for us.
Yes, Lord.
We thank you, we pray. In Jesus' name, amen.